The evening was in full swing. Loud music was playing in the room. The guests were laughing, clinking glasses, and enjoying the light, festive atmosphere. James stood at the bar, leaning on it with his elbow, and seemed lost in his thoughts. But he was actually watching. His gaze was fixed on Sarah, his wife, who was talking animatedly with colleagues. She looked flawless in a sparkling dress and smiled the same dazzling smile that had captivated him at the time. But now there was Andrew in her company, a colleague whom James had always perceived as too friendly. He tried not to think the worst, but it was at that moment that something flashed between them, a look, a slight, barely noticeable smile. James couldn't have been mistaken. Over the 10 years of their marriage, he had learned to recognize Sarah's every emotion. And that look spoke of something more than just friendship. "Hey, James!" A voice came from behind him. James turned around and saw Mark, his old friend and colleague from the next apartment. "You've been standing here like a statue all evening. Buddy, you need to relax." Mark handed him a glass of wine. "Yes, you're probably right." James nodded, trying his best to push away the disturbing thoughts. He took a glass, took a small sip, but even the alcohol didn't help. He was uncomfortable with the fact that Sarah was laughing with Andrew, lightly touching his arm. This touch, so insignificant at first glance, made James's heart pound faster. Maybe he's just winding himself up? Maybe it's just paranoia? "I have to trust her," he reminded himself. After all, they have been together for 10 years. They have 2 children. And Sarah has always been a pillar of support for him. But why then did this feeling of anxiety not let him go? The phone in his pocket vibrated, pulling James out of his thoughts. He apologized to Mark and went out into the hallway, where it was a little quieter. The name of the boss appeared on the screen. "James, we need to leave immediately. There has been a robbery in the city, and your presence is required." The voice on the other end was stern, not allowing objections. "Understood. I'm on my way," James replied, casting a quick glance towards the hall. Sarah was still laughing with Andrew, as if she didn't notice his absence. James frowned, but said nothing. Deciding not to spoil the evening with explanations, he headed for the exit. "Just a couple of hours," he reassured himself. "I'll be back and everything will be fine." Time flew by unnoticed. When James returned, the clock was well past midnight. The party was ending. The guests were about to leave. There were only a few people left in the room. Sarah was sitting at the table with Andrew, as well as their boss David and his wife Emily. James entered the room and approached them. The atmosphere at the table was strange, as if something had changed. Sarah greeted him with a friendly smile. "How are you? Everything is fine?" "What is it?" she asked, as if nothing had happened. "It's the usual thing, nothing serious." James nodded curtly, but his gaze was fixed on Andrew. When he saw that James had returned, he suddenly got up from the table and, after saying goodbye to Sarah, hurriedly left. James caught Sarah saying something softly in farewell, but he couldn't make out the words. There was an unpleasant twinge in my chest. He and Sarah went home, and at first glance, everything looked the same as always. But the feeling of anxiety settled deep in his soul and was not going to go away. Over the next few days, James tried to live as usual, but that evening did not leave his mind. The thought that something was wrong between Sarah and Andrew was eating away at him from the inside. And then one evening, when he returned from work and went to the toilet, he accidentally overheard a conversation. Voices were coming from the next booth. He recognized them immediately. It was Andrew and their colleague Kyle. "I can't believe you pulled this off." Kyle laughed. "Come on, it was easier than you think," Andrew replied with a note of smugness. "A couple of cocktails and she came to me on her own." James was busy, so you could say the stars came together. James froze, his heart beating faster. He leaned against the door of the stall, trying not to betray his presence. "And how is she?" Kyle asked. "To be honest, she turned out to be even better than I expected. We were sitting in the car behind the club, and she almost pushed me herself." Andrew grinned. Those words pierced James like a knife. He stood motionless, feeling his fists clench painfully. Everything he had heard sounded too true to be fiction. When the conversation ended, James came out of the bathroom, feeling a wave of anger rising in him. Could this be true? "My Sarah," he repeated in his mind, unable to believe what he had heard. He sat down on a nearby bench and covered his face with his hands, trying to come to his senses. The world he knew began to crumble. Now he needed to know the truth to the end. It was a sleepless night. James was tossing and turning in bed, and Sarah was sleeping quietly next to him. Her breathing was even and peaceful. He looked at her in the dark and wondered, is this the same woman I've been living with for 10 years? Or was it all a lie? The next morning he decided to act. It was necessary to collect evidence. There was no longer any doubt that something was going on behind his back, and he had to find out. After that conversation he heard in the bathroom, James could no longer get rid of his obsessive thoughts. He felt like the reality that he and Sarah had been building for 10 years was cracking. Now her every look, every gesture seemed suspicious. He found himself involuntarily trying to figure out what was going on in her head, as if it wasn't his marriage, but a complicated case in which he needed to get to the truth. The next morning, he woke up earlier than usual. Sarah was still asleep, covered with a blanket. Her face looked calm and serene. James stared at her for a long time, trying to find something familiar, something that would restore his confidence in her. But I didn't find anything. She looked the same as before, but something had changed inside him. While Sarah was cooking breakfast, James was trying to behave as usual. But her every move, every laugh, every brief glance aroused his suspicions. It seemed to him that she was hiding something. "You're kind of quiet today," Sarah remarked, pouring him coffee. "I'm just tired," he replied shortly, trying not to meet her eyes. He knew he couldn't just hope for the best anymore. Proof was needed, accurate, irrefutable. Detective instinct told him that emotions can deceive, but facts can never. At work, James looked into the technical department where surveillance and recording devices were stored. He chose 2 small transmitters and a miniature camera. He planned to put one transmitter unnoticed in Sarah's bag and hide the other in her car. He will take the camera with him in case he needs to collect visual evidence. James felt his resolve grow as he returned to his desk. His fear and suspicion turned into a cold-blooded plan. Now it wasn't just a suspicion, it was an investigation, and he had to bring it to an end. In the evening, Sarah returned home in a good mood. She laughed with the kids, cooked dinner, and talked to James about work matters as if nothing had changed. But James knew something was wrong. When she was distracted by the call and went into another room, he quickly put the first transmitter in her bag. At that moment, his heart was pounding wildly, but he knew he had to be careful. He couldn't afford to make a mistake. The next morning, while Sarah was getting ready for work, James pretended that he was going to help her with the car. While she adjusted her makeup in the mirror, he carefully hid the second transmitter under the seat trim. Now he could monitor her movements and listen to conversations wherever she was. For the first few days, nothing suspicious happened. Sarah lived a normal life. Work, home, taking care of children. James started to think that maybe he was really winding himself up. But one evening, she said she needed to go to the hairdresser. "I can't look at those split ends anymore," she said, laughing. James smiled back, but inside he tensed. This was his chance to find out the truth. "Okay, just don't delay it. Dinner is almost ready," he said, trying to hide his tension. "Don't worry. I'll be quick," she replied with a wink. When Sarah left, James grabbed the car keys and quickly left the house. He knew he couldn't drive too close, or she'd notice the surveillance. So he kept his distance, monitoring her movements through an app linked to the transmitter. A few minutes later, Sarah turned off the main road and stopped not at a barbershop, but at a small motel on the outskirts of town. James felt his heart beat faster. This can't be true, he thought, but everything pointed to it. He parked at a safe distance and watched Sarah get out of the car. She looked around, as if afraid that she might be seen. A minute later, Andrew came up to her. He put his hand on her shoulder, and together they disappeared through the motel doors. James's insides tightened. He wanted to rush in there, make a scene, demand an explanation. But he knew he had to stay cool. Without proof, his words meant nothing. He turned on the camera and began recording everything that happened at the motel. Every second seemed like an eternity, but James held himself in check. He watched every movement, every gesture. Andrew and Sarah were inside for at least an hour. When they left, James continued recording recording how they exchanged glances and hugged before going their separate ways. Everything was clear. But this is not the end. James knew that he needed not only visual evidence, but also a recording of their conversations. He returned to the car and checked the data from the transmitters. The conversation between Sarah and Andrew confirmed his worst fears. It was risky, Sarah said, her voice cheerful, but a little worried. But it was worth it, right? Andrew replied, chuckling. James couldn't listen anymore. He turned off the recording and dropped his head on the steering wheel. Everything he believed in collapsed in an instant. When James returned home, Sarah was already there, sitting at the table and eating dinner with the children, as if nothing had happened. Her face was as calm and serene as ever. "How's the haircut?" "What is it?" he asked, trying not to betray his condition. "Great. I like it," she replied, unaware that her lie had already been revealed. James looked at her, and there was no more love in his eyes. Just emptiness and cold. A decision was maturing inside him, from which there was no turning back. James lay awake all night, staring at the ceiling. Sarah was sleeping next to her. Her breathing was calm, serene, as if nothing had changed in her world. And in James's world, everything collapsed. The lies and betrayal that he managed to capture on camera and transmitters did not leave him the slightest hope. It wasn't just cheating. It was a stab in the back from the person he loved more than anything in the world. His mind raced from rage to devastation. Fragments of their conversations rang in my head. "She came by herself. It was worth it, right?" These words were spinning in his mind like an annoying swarm of bees. He wanted to put them out of his mind, but he knew he had to get to the end. It was too late to retreat now. The next day, James decided not to show that he knew anything. He behaved as usual, helping the children with breakfast and talking to Sarah as if nothing had happened. But an icy chill gripped him inside. Every word she said, every movement seemed fake to him. He looked at her and saw a completely different person, not the woman he had once loved. Sarah behaved as usual, chatted about work, joked, and made plans for the weekend. James listened to her, but everything seemed to be empty sounds. He realized that he could no longer trust a word she said. "Are you working late today?" he casually asked at breakfast. "Yes, I may be late. We have a meeting with a client," she replied, pouring herself a cup of coffee. Her voice sounded light, as if she wasn't hiding anything. But James already knew what would happen next. He realized that their meetings with Andrew were not just one-time accidents. And this job was just a convenient cover for another date. James could barely concentrate at work. His thoughts were focused on the notes he had made. He replayed all the details over and over in his head. How they hugged at the motel, how they laughed together. It seemed to him that he was stuck in a nightmare from which he could not get out. After much thought, he made a decision. We can't wait any longer. He had to put everything in its place and deal with it once and for all. James called his lawyer at lunchtime. He had been in contact for a long time in case his suspicions were confirmed. Now all doubts were dispelled, and James decided to act. "I'm ready to file for divorce," he told the lawyer, trying to hide the tremor in his voice. "Understood," the lawyer replied shortly. "I will prepare the documents today. Do you have all the evidence?" "Yes. Videos, audio recordings. That's more than enough." They agreed to meet in a few days to sign the necessary papers and discuss the details. James wanted to achieve not only a divorce, but also to keep the house and custody of the children. Sarah's betrayal left her with no right to anything. That evening, Sarah returned home later than usual. James met her in the hallway, trying to look calm. He could feel the tension building inside him, but he didn't want to make any sudden movements until the time was right. "How was the meeting?" "What is it?" he asked, taking off his jacket. "It's okay. The client turned out to be quite demanding, but we agreed," Sarah replied, putting her bag on the table. Her voice sounded light and at ease. But James knew the truth. He heard their conversation through the transmitter. He knew that there was no client and that she had spent the evening with Andrew again. They had dinner in silence. James caught Sarah's attentive gazes on him, as if she was trying to figure out what was wrong with him. But he remained calm and restrained, as in an interrogation. When the children went to bed, Sarah sat down on the sofa with him. "You're kind of weird today. Everything is fine?" "What is it?" she asked, putting her hand on his shoulder. James felt a wave of rage sweep over him, but he restrained himself. "It's okay, I'm just tired," he replied, looking away. But inside, he was already preparing for the next step. The next day, James spent most of the day completing the final preparations. He put all the evidence in a folder: audio files, videos, photographs. Every movement of Sarah and Andrew was recorded and cataloged. He wanted everything to be perfect when meeting with a lawyer. When he returned home in the evening, Sarah was about to leave again. "I'm going to meet a friend," she said, putting on her coat. "Don't expect me early." James just nodded, watching her walk out the door. He already knew that there would be no girlfriend. But instead of following her as before, he stayed at home. He sat down at his desk and opened his laptop. Recordings of their conversations played in his headphones, making his heart beat faster. But now it wasn't just anger. It was determination. He opened the folder with the divorce papers and began to look through them. There was no doubt left inside him. His marriage is over, and all he had to do was put an end to it. When Sarah returned home late at night, James was sitting on the couch in the living room. He looked calm, but inside he was seething. "Are you awake?" She was surprised, taking off her coat. "I've been waiting for you," he replied softly, looking up at her. Sarah froze in place, sensing something was amiss. "What happened?" "What is it?" she asked cautiously. James slowly got up and walked over to the table. He took out his phone and put it on the table in front of her. "I think you need to see this." Sarah picked up the phone and her face turned pale when she saw the video. A recording of her and Andrew leaving the motel, hugging and laughing. It's not what you think," she began, her voice trembling. But James wasn't listening anymore. He didn't need her excuses. It was already over. There was a heavy silence in the room. Sarah stood clutching James's phone, her face pale and her fingers trembling. She couldn't take her eyes off the screen. There on video, every moment of betrayal was recorded, every detail of their meeting with Andrew. James stood in front of her like a statue, with a stony face and a ruthless gaze. "It's not what you think, James," Sarah whispered softly, putting the phone down on the table. Her voice was trembling, and there were tears in her eyes. "It was only once. This is a mistake. I didn't want this to happen." But in response, he only slowly shook his head. There was no pain or disappointment in his eyes anymore, just a cold, heavy understanding. "One mistake?" His voice was low, almost a whisper. "How many were there really, Sarah? How many times have you lied to my face?" She took a step forward, trying to touch him, but he pulled away, as if her touch was unbearable for him. "I love you, James. It doesn't mean anything. It's simple. It's just stupid." He grinned, but there was no humor or forgiveness in that grin, only bitterness. "Doesn't mean anything?" he repeated, looking at her as if he had never seen her before. "You destroyed everything we had. You destroyed my trust, our family. And that doesn't mean anything to you?" Sarah covered her face with her hands, and her shoulders shook with sobs. "I do not know how it happened. Everything got out of control. I wasn't going to do that." "But she did," James interrupted her harshly. "And it doesn't matter how exactly it happened. The important thing is that it has already happened." He walked over to the desk, where a folder of documents was ready. Divorce. That word sounded like a sentence in his head. Not just her, but everything they once shared together. He took the folder and threw it on the table in front of Sarah. "Everything you need is here," he said coldly. "We're getting divorced. I'm applying tomorrow." Sarah looked at the folder with despair in her eyes. "No, James. Don't do this. You are welcome. Give me a chance to fix it. We can start over. I'll do everything right." James turned away, walking across the room like a caged lion. Rage mixed with disappointment boiled in his chest. "Start over?" He smiled bitterly, looking out the window. "Where should I start, Sarah? Since you lied to me when you were dating him? Or the way you told me you loved me and you slept with someone else?" She rushed to him, grabbing his hands. "James, I'm begging you. It was a mistake. I don't want to lose you. I love you. I love our family." He jerked out of her grasp. "Do you like it?" His voice dropped to a hoarse whisper. "If you did, you wouldn't have ruined everything." Suddenly, all his accumulated patience snapped like a tightrope. He stopped restraining himself. He remembered every lie, every excuse she had uttered in recent weeks. All her excuses and deceptions were now embedded in his mind like nails. Did you want freedom? His voice became harsh and cold. You'll get it. Pack your things and leave. Sarah recoiled as if he had hit her. No. James, please. This is also my home. Where am I going? To Andrew, he snapped. Let him take care of you now. Her face was contorted with pain and fear. She tried to say something, but the words stuck in her throat. She seemed to realize that no excuses would help anymore. James wasn't going to continue this conversation. He opened the closet and took out her travel bag. Throwing it on the floor, he pointed to the door. Go away, Sarah, and don't come back. Her lips were trembling and tears were streaming from her eyes. She knelt down in front of him, begging, Please, James, give me at least one more chance. I'll fix it. For us. For the sake of the children. But his heart had already turned to stone. He looked at her as if she were a stranger. You've already made your choice, he said quietly but firmly. Now I'm making mine. Sarah realized that her pleas were useless. She got up slowly, picked up her bag, and headed for the door. At the last moment, she looked back, hoping to see at least a shadow of forgiveness in his eyes. But there was only an empty, cold expression. Goodbye, Sarah, he said, opening the door. She went out into the darkness of the night, and the door slammed shut behind her with a thud. James remained standing by the door, breathing heavily, as if he had just completed a marathon. There was an ominous silence in the room. It seemed to him that the air had become heavier, and the walls were pressing down on him. But with it came a strange relief. It's all over. He went to the window and watched Sarah get into her car. She sat behind the wheel for a while longer before starting the engine and driving off into the night. Her silhouette disappeared into the darkness. James was left alone in the house, which now belonged only to him. But there was no peace in this loneliness. He knew that he had a difficult path ahead of him, a new life, without lies and betrayal, but also without the woman he once loved with all his heart. He took a folder of documents from the table and sat down on the sofa. The room was quiet except for the ticking of the clock. James looked at his watch and realized that it had only been a couple of minutes since Sarah left. But it seemed to him that an eternity had passed. Opening the folder, he ran his eyes over the documents. Divorce, division of property, custody of children. Everything was prepared. Tomorrow, he would officially end their marriage. It was a hard night. James replayed the events of the last few days over and over in his head, as if trying to figure out exactly where everything went wrong. But there was no answer. All he knew was that this was the end, and there is no turning back anymore. At dawn, he got out of bed and dressed. The house was quiet and empty, but that emptiness no longer scared him. She became his new reality. James took the keys and left the house. A new life was waiting for him outside the door. It didn't promise to be easy, but at least it was honest, and he was ready to meet her face to face. The next morning, James went to his lawyer's office. His steps were firm, but there was still a heaviness inside. The divorce, which was supposed to be a release, actually felt like a defeat. He signed the papers with cold determination, as if he were putting the last end to a long and painful story. It's all set, James, the lawyer said, putting the documents in a folder. After Sarah receives the summons, the case can be closed within a couple of weeks. James nodded, feeling neither joy nor relief. It was a necessary measure, and now all he had to do was move forward. When he returned home, the house greeted him with silence. Furniture, books, children's toys. Everything reminded of the past, of the years they had lived together. Now those memories seemed distant, as if he was looking at his life through a cloudy glass. He went into the bedroom, opened the closet, and saw an empty place where Sarah's things used to hang. This picture was strangely symbolic. Her absence was felt more strongly than her presence. It wasn't just an empty hanger. It was a metaphor for his whole life, which now needed filling. James decided to clean up the house. He went through the rooms, putting away things that reminded him of Sarah. Photos from family trips, her books, souvenirs that they bought together. Each discarded item brought him a small but important sense of completion. By the time he finished, it was late afternoon. He poured himself a glass of whiskey and sat down in the living room. For the first time in a long time, the house was quiet, and the silence no longer weighed on him. She became his ally, a sign that life was going on. A few days later, James received a message from his lawyer. Sarah had agreed to all the terms of the divorce. She wasn't trying to fight for a house or property. Probably realizing that her act deprived her of the right to demand anything, she chose to leave without resistance. This news brought James a strange sense of completion. He realized that this stage of his life was really over. Saturday came, and James decided to spend time with the children. They went to the park, walked along the lake, and ate ice cream. The children were laughing, and James suddenly felt that for the first time in a long time, he could breathe deeply. Despite the pain, he was grateful to have children. For their sake, he knew he had to move forward. When they got home, James put the kids to bed and stayed in the living room. In his hands, he held the last envelope that had come from the lawyer. Inside were copies of all the divorce papers. He opened the envelope, glanced at the papers briefly, and carefully folded them back. The divorce was officially finalized. Late in the evening, James went out on the porch of the house. He stood looking up at the star-studded night sky. There was a slight chill in the air, heralding the onset of winter. He was free now, free from lies, betrayal, and deception. But along with this came the understanding that freedom is not the end of the path, but only its beginning. He had to learn to live anew without looking back at the past. James took out his phone and scrolled through his contact list. His gaze lingered on Sarah's name. Once the name closest to him was now just an inscription on the screen. He looked at her for a few seconds and then, without hesitation, deleted the contact. The phone went off quietly, and James put it in his pocket. He returned to the house and closed the door behind him. This day was the last time he allowed himself to think about the past. Now he had a new goal, to build a life in which there would be no place for lies and betrayal. And he knew he could do it, and that's where today's story ends. If you liked it, don't forget to like it and leave a comment. Your feedback helps the algorithms promote my videos. If this is your first time here, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. It helps me keep creating new stories for you. Thank you for watching to the end, and see you in the next video.